and NP are called NP complete. And VRP is one of NP hard problems, so there's no exact solution or in literature for any size instance. They can solve for limited size instances exactly. And in literature, there's a Drexel. He categorized a special subset of problems in VRP that deals with synchronization constraints. And this is really relevant because the problem that I'm proposing today is called VRP with movement synchronization. So it synchronizes based on movement. But there's a very generic problem called VRPTT, which is vehicle routing problem with trailers and transshipment. It stemmed from, I think, delivering milk between farmers, warehouses, and depots. And they had 4 different types of vehicles. And they categorized them with like vehicles that you can move on its own or needs to be pulled, and vehicles that can actually service the customer or it's used to help the service. And this problem contained 5 different aspects of synchronization. So it required task synchronization, operation synchronization, movement, load, and resource. And this is like the granddaddy of the synchronization problem, and if you solve that one, mine will be trivial to solve as well, but no solution exists. So if there doesn't exist an exact algorithm to solve these problems, what people tend to do is to rely on heuristic solutions. And heuristic solution gives a good enough approximation to your problem. So an example I thought of was Riemann sum. So if you didn't want to know the exact area underneath a curve on a graph, you can use Riemann sum to approximate that area, and that would be an example of a heuristic. So my problem is called VRPMS, and there's limited literature that currently exists. Here are some, and the general format of these papers is that they use a exact formulation to describe the problem, and typically they relax some of the formulations or develop some kind of heuristic to solve larger instances of their proposed problems, and they often recommend looking into what's called meta-heuristic methods. So what are meta-heuristics? Here's a definition taken from a book by Glover, and essentially it says meta-heuristics are solution methods that use the interaction between local improvements and some kind of high-level strategy. And the big difference between meta-heuristic and heuristic is that meta-heuristic are agnostic to your problem, which means that it is a strategy that can be used to solve any kind of optimization problem, whereas a heuristic is identifying what problem you have and finding the shortcuts or some of the ways to circumvent some of the hard constraints and develop a quicker computation or approximate the answer quicker, whereas meta-heuristics can be just applied generally. It's not dependent on the nature of the problem. And here's just a funny comic from XKCD. It's funny if you do genetic algorithm or understand it, but basically you don't want to mix Skynet. Here's a big, lovely chart showing all the different meta-heuristics that's currently, available and people study. And the big 2 categories are the 2 in blue. So population type, population approach, and trajectory approach. And population approach is basically you have all your solutions in a population and you're trying to develop strategies that build on or evolve or build on the population until you get your best solution. Trajectory is you focus on one and you try to improve that single solution until it gets better. The 4 that's commonly used for routing problems, so VRPs, TSPs, ant colony optimization. They mimic how ants cooperate and communicate with pheromone trails when they find food. Simulated annealing mimics the way metal annealing process works and how it increases the ductility, and it translates that to some kind of analogy into actual routing. Taboo search, pretty famous, everyone probably has heard of it. It uses local search and a memory structure to help to never go back to a step that's potentially not as good. And the important one for today's discussion is genetic algorithm, because that's the meta heuristic I used to solve the problem that I have. And it mimics Darwinian evolutionary theory and survival of the fittest principle. So if you took Abdul Hay's ETS class, you have experience with this. But if you haven't yet, here's just a quick primer. So you start off with a binary gene that can be 0 or 1. And you have a chromosome that's comprised of all these genes, and they encode into a potential solution of the problem. And you have a bunch of these chromosomes, and it makes a population. And so in this population, you have all the potential solutions to your problem from A, B, C, D, E, F, G onwards. And you take this population, you apply an evaluation fitness. So depending on the objective that you're trying to maximize or minimize, you have an evaluation fitness that you can apply to each chromosome in your population and obtain their fitness values. And using some kind of selection process, it could be, pick the best one, pick the best 10, pick the best 50%. You select the best ones and you make them undergo mating or mutation process to ideally keep the traits that makes that solution fit in the first place and pass it down to the future generations. And then you get a new set of populations, and you can go through a stop criteria. Maybe you've reached the end of your computation time, or you found the best solution available. And if you haven't, you just repeat this process. And then you pick your best chromosome from your population, and that's your new solution. But most importantly, you have to check if it became Skynet. So if it didn't, then it's fine. So moving on to my methodology, I developed an exact mixed integer description of the problem. Using genetic algorithm, I developed a meta-heuristic to solve larger instances of this problem. And using that, I analyzed practical instances of these problems to assess the differences between the technology variations. So using drones, using walkers, or using robots, and how they can help or assist a truck driver with delivering packages. So this is the formal description of my problem. So we have a heavy resource, which we label H, and a light resource, which can be drones or all the things I talked about, and we want to coordinate their movement. And what's special about the way I describe this problem is that we allow the heavy resource to simultaneously deliver and pick up, and it's a transportation method for the light resource. So a lot of literature hinges on the fact that the light resource delivers to a location and then comes back, or meets the heavy at the exact next location. It doesn't really allow for the light to make several deliveries or meet with the heavy later on. So customers can be served to H or light. So this is a restriction from the trailer transshipment problem, where customers can sometimes be served by one or the other, or both. Like there's more constraints in that category. The light resource has some kind of limited range or capacity, and the goal is to find the least expensive set of routes for your heavy and light resources, and you're able to service all the customers. So the two main features we're studying is the movement synchronization between the heavy and the light, and how the different enabling technologies and the parameters affect the cost. So this would be a typical route involving an H and a light resource. They start off at people together, deliver as a tandem to 1. The light departs to deliver 3, 4, and 5, while the heavy is delivering 2 and 6, and they rejoin at 6. They go to 8 together, the light departs, meets back with heavy at 7, and return to the depot. So this is the mixed integer programming of this problem was formulated and programmed into Python using Ruby. And we were able to solve some very simple instances of this. So here's an example of what it's a movement synchronization, but the light is constrained to 0 capacity, so it's effectively a VRP. And this is what it looks like for 5 customers located at these locations. And if we were to increase the capacity of the light to allow for some deliveries, and decrease the heavy capacity, maybe it could produce a route that requires 2 heavy and 1 light. And then if there's 10 customers, here's what a possible solution could be visualized as, given the variable parameters that we set on the right. So one of the limitations of this research is because it's seldomly studied and it's a relatively novel field, there's not a lot of existing VRPMS problems plus solutions out there. So typically for a VRP study, you would take existing benchmarks and compare against your own. But because that's a limitation of this problem, so what I had to do with what I was given, so I chose a bunch of VRP test instances from a paper by Augurat, and essentially I broke it down. There's 3 different sets: set P, set A, and set B. And I believe set P has customer sizes ranging from 10 to 20 customers. Set P has 31 to 38 customers, and set B has 30 to 40 customers. And the percentage gap is how well my mixed integer programming algorithm did against what was published. So it did well against set P with 0.97% difference. Set A didn't do so well, but an average of 10% with a bigger variance. And set B was 3.75%. So I think for set A and set B, my performance could have been better if I had better programming skills, maybe, or with better knowledge of the Ruby API, because a lot of these instances were actually timed out. I set a limit to 10,000 computation seconds, just because I didn't want to go on forever, and a lot of them reached that maximum before fully converging. So I had to end that and just take what was given. So that might be a reason for the bad performance for those 2 sets. And here is a flowchart of my genetic algorithm. So as you can see, it's slightly different from the simple primer I gave. But essentially, you start, you generate a bunch of individuals or chromosomes to form your initial population. You do an evaluation step. And what I did is I did a roulette selection. So the roulette is, imagine a roulette at a casino, but every slice, the size of the slice is dependent on how fit they are. So the fitter they are, the bigger the slice. So they have a higher probability of chosen every time you spin the roulette. And then I also selected elite. So I wanted to always keep the best solutions I had at every single generation. I didn't want to potentially lose it. So I kept a few elites, selected the rest to form my, but I kept it separate. So I got some potential offsprings and elite offspring. And for the potential offspring, I mutated them based on some kind of percentage. I think it was 0.05. And I obtained mutated offsprings. And then I took it and it underwent mating. Also based on some percentage, maybe 80% of the time they'll mate. What's cool about this is that the mating process is called partially matched crossover. It's a special mating function developed by a guy called Goldberg in 1985. And what it can do is simultaneously search the order and the value of your chromosome. So in routing, it's very important what order your decoded or your encoded customers are. And you want to keep that ordering if it's good. So you want to lose that information. And a lot of the pure binary, the mating processes, they don't really care about the ordering of your chromosome. They just care about the value that you get. And so before this technique was proposed, you couldn't really solve routing problems with genetic algorithms. So they were actually deemed to be GA hard. Again, be hard, but GA hard. So with this, you can keep some of the ordering, so the good ordering traits and the good value traits, and you can keep that for your future generations. And then, so this process is part of what's, using a not very 2018 term, master-slave process, where you first solve a master VRP problem with an extended capacity for the vehicles, and then you break each solution of that VRP problem into TSPs, and you resolve that as one with movement synchronizations, and then you recombine it back to get a bunch of VRPMS solutions. And I had to do it this way because the complexity that was introduced by the light resource there was too much hurdles to jump, and I had to find a way to cut down on some of the complexities, and this was my approach. And this is a result of that approach and how it compares against the mixed integer programming I developed earlier, or we talked about earlier. On the right side here, or on the right side, this is just a pure TSP solution on customer size 10, 15, and 20. And this is how they did against the mixed integer programming. And then on the left is what happens when you produce a VRPMS solution with the same methods. So it averages to around 30, 20, 20% solution gap. So it's not perfect, but we had to use genetic algorithm because even for these customer sizes where it's 15 and 20, I'm getting a speed increase of 200, 250x. And I can actually scale this to solve customer sizes with 50, 100, where MIPs were timing out at around 15 customers. So I can't really perform any kind of sensitivity analysis for what we want to look at, which is how these parameters, how do parameters affect this kind of operation. So in order to, and so what we did was we inputted a bunch of parameters we estimated a bunch of parameters for the different technologies when we put it into our GA process. So all of this is a ratio to the heavy, so to a truck. And so the capital cost of a drone to the truck is 25 to 1, so it's 25 times cheaper to acquire a drone. And to give a sense, in real numbers, I think drones, like say a truck costs 80K, a drone 25 times cheaper would be around, I think, 3,000-ish. And so that seems like a reasonable number to us, and based on some quick Google searches of how much do commercial drones cost, like this is the kind of the factors that we settled on. And we assumed that the capacity of a drone is 100 to 1. So if a truck has 100 capacity, drone has 1. The range of the drone is a length that I define as 200, which is only useful when it's useful in the solution space that I define later, but this can be all changed, but this one doesn't really come into play as much as capacity. Usually, obviously, capacity constrained here. The travel cost is 5 times cheaper per unit length for the drone to travel because we assumed it was based on electricity and potentially cheaper than gas. And it also, the study that we took this value from was also based on maintenance cost and I think some other intermediate lifetime costs to get to this final value of 5 to 1. It wasn't just cost of electricity, cost of gasoline or something like that. So the travel speed we assume will be 5 times faster because it can bypass the network, the road network. So congestion and stuff like that doesn't really matter, it just flies through it, straight distance, as opposed to Manhattan. And the weight cost, we assume that compared to a truck, that it would be effectively free because it's autonomous, so no one is there to monitor it. So if it has to wait for the truck during the rejoining step, it's better to favor the drone to be waiting for the truck as opposed to the truck waiting for the drone. And a similar delay cost. So if delay cost means if you are delayed to deliver to your customer, this doesn't really come into play because we never constrain the customers to have tight delivery windows. We do another broad stopping time, but that's for later. So for the robot, we made it a little bit more expensive than the drone, 15 to 1. It can carry more than the drone by 4 times. That checks out, right? And the range is slightly higher, double. But it has a cheaper travel cost than the drone because of some of the maintenance things that we talked about. It has the same travel speed as a truck because we assume it might travel slower on the sidewalk, and then that might balance out with the congestion that the truck faces, but travels at a faster time. Effectively 0 weight cost and the same delay cost. And the walker is the Encore walker. We have some solid stats on that. So this is based on some of the stats we got from the company. So 8 to 1 to hire someone and train them. So more expensive than the robot or the drone. And it can carry more because we can potentially have a bag that can carry 10 items or a trolley that can carry 10 items. It seems feasible that a person can carry 10 shoebox items. higher range. It's not constrained by any kind of electricity or battery and stuff like that. Has a more expensive travel cost because it's a person walking around. Has a slower, it has a faster travel speed than the robot, just because we assume, well, we observed some walkers in the downtown walk network for one of the older projects, and they were just flying past us. So it seems like in operation, walking speed is not really a good indication. It's be like the walkers are usually running towards their location. And there's a weight cost for the walker because now you're paying them on an hourly basis, so we wanted to establish the weight cost for them and the same delay cost. And so what we did, we solved this over 50 and 100 customer instances using the genetic algorithm based on these attributes, and solved it over, I think, 20 times with randomized customer locations. And this is the result for the routes. So on the left, we have route cost, or on the y-axis, we have route cost, and the two sections is 50 customer, 100 customer. The blue is the truck. Orange is truck with drones. Green is truck with robots, truck with walkers. And so we see a savings of nearly 0% for the drones because we're only allowing it to deliver one piece of package, and that doesn't really save much in terms of the savings that it's trying to provide, or at least with the parameters that we gave it. The robot did a bit better with 10% reduction cost, and the walker, no surprise here, 16% reduction because the high capacity that it can hold, and given the pay that we're giving it, it's able to reduce the route cost. And another interesting thing has to do with capital cost. So here we expanded the customer base from 50, 100 to 200 and 400. And what you're looking at is the capital cost saved with each technology alternative. So for 50, so essentially in real life, a lot of times the delivery trucks can carry more than what is on their route, but they don't because they're constrained by time. So to reflect this reality, we set a relatively tight end time window for all the customers. So for example, if we have 50 customers and our truck actually has a capacity of 100, technically the GA should only use one truck to make all the deliveries, but because we apply this relatively strict ending time window, it actually needs two trucks to complete all the deliveries, and effectively using only 25% of the truck space. And this is where we can see potentially bigger savings. We wanted to see if we can see bigger savings by replacing one whole truck with some kind of alternative, or like this composite route that we're creating. So for the 50 customers, drones cannot replace the capacity of one truck. So it doesn't save anything for the capital cost. Whereas the robot in the 50 and the 100 case can potentially save more than deploying a walker. But once you get to larger customer sizes, the capital cost you get from the walker comes back to be higher. So the final takeaways from my research, I guess it's, given that the assumed physical attributes that we've inputted, I think that drone technology is not as competitive as the other two, as a walker, as a traditional walker, at this current time. So depending on how this industry develops and matures, and if we can create like even bigger savings for the transport costs or the lowering the capital cost, and more crucially expanding the capacity of a drone, this might be a viable alternative delivery solution in the future. And but nevertheless, express courier companies should look into how adopting a movement synchronized alternative technology can help with their day-to-day operation, because it does create route savings and capital cost savings. And also for future work, this is something that I don't really talk about in the presentation, but more so in the thesis, is that I used a greedy clustering algorithm to break apart the different components of my solution. And it's simple and it's easy to implement, but as you can see by the different solution gaps, it didn't do as good of a job as I hoped. And so I think for future work, that's a very key, easy low-hanging fruit to hit. And another low-hanging fruit is there are starting to be more papers on this topic, yet there's no consensus like instance library for solving these to benchmark against different people's solutions. There are benchmarks for normal VRPs, VRP time windows, CVRPs, all those kinds, because it's just a more established area. But another great idea would be to implement a library with these kind of problems with standardized attributes for each one, and then you can start comparing against different types of solution techniques. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation. Special thanks to Matt, Gallery, Kenush, and Selena, and the rest of our research group. Yeah. Yes, Adam?
So first of all, really good, interesting presentation. I'm not super familiar with GA or optimization stuff, so really interesting to sort of get some insight into that. I had a question about some sensitivity analysis. So I know for those parameters you were discussing for the drone, the robot, and the walker, the assumptions you made, they seem pretty reasonable, but I was wondering if you ran the GA with sort of different values or ranges of values to see how things differ. Or if you just sort of said, my assumptions are good enough, I'm just going to run with those.
In a way, no, yeah, that's a good point, and I would have done that.
Yeah,
but at the, I kind of looked at it as those three being just three different sensitivities of the alternative technology.
Okay. That makes sense.
So there are three snapshots of what could be practical right now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there is a varying degree of magnitudes for all the different parameters. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see which one influence, I'm assuming capacity, but influence which one most. Yeah. Oh, sure.
Thank you very much for this presentation. The topic is very interesting. I have a question about variability. I mean, the context of this problem is urban logistics, right?
Yeah.
Like downtown areas,
yeah.
Where there's a lot of variability in travel time. So, for example, a truck that is deploying a drone or a sidewalk robot, and suppose, or you're scheduling it to meet with it later on at some point, there's obviously a lot of variability and stochasticity in the system. So my first question is, I presume you didn't take this into consideration in your work.
No.
So my follow-up question is, what's your recommendation in terms of, how to tackle this problem realistically if we were actually to deploy this kind of method in a real-world application in downtown area? How do we deal with? Because I can see a lot of similarity with, scheduling transit services, and travel time on any given segment is also, has an average and has distribution essentially.
Yeah.
But the transit company is always confronted with the issue of what travel time should I use when I publish my timetables? So you can see some analogy.
Okay. I think a way to do this, to implement the dynamic travel behavior of our network would be essentially get snapshots from any or some kind of macro simulation model or micro simulation model, depending on how big your area is, with the travel time on the links. And what I did was assign customers to a square space of 500 by 500. I assigned 50 customers, but now I can assign them to actual links. And when I find routes, I can also match them to the links with travel time on it. Then I can, as a separate evaluation step, pre-calculate all of the time that it would take and add that as an additional cost component for my evaluation for my GA and how fit they are. So I would look for, on top of all these costs, also minimizing travel time or something to the effect of minimizing travel time. And I think that would be an ad hoc way of solving that issue, but this is already complex enough. I don't know if I really want to do that.
Yeah, there is an asset discussion because there are some cost implications in
Yeah.
comparison with the three methods of the.
Yes.
So, for example, you develop a very tight routing and schedule, and the foot walker goes and waits for the truck for when it's being stuck in traffic.
Right.
There's a cost implied there.
Yes.
It was a sidewalk problem. There isn't really any
Yeah.
marginal cost.
Yes. So I try, yeah, I have it capturing that effect, but not necessarily reflecting
Sure.
if those effects in real life or in this operation. Yeah. You had a question?
It was actually almost identical to the one that was previously. I was
Oh,
just wondering on how you decided on those parameters.
Oh, yeah, it was a lot of just pseudo literature review. Yeah.
So two quick things. One, in your GA, you were mentioning elite
Yes.
offspring. So just sorry, quick clarification. I missed it, but do you use the elite offspring for like? Is that how you identify which offspring are mating, or are they just put into the next population so that their characteristics are fully maintained?
Your second point, yeah. So they're kept. They're not.
Okay.
They're going to be. They basically are protected through the mating and mutation
Okay,
process.
so
They'll be
there's
kept for the next
a
one.
process by which you choose which ones mate, but then in addition to that, you're identifying
Yes.
solution.
Yeah, I found that
Nice.
it sped up the way that my GA worked by the convergence much faster because initially the way if I just let it do its thing, like it should work technically, but it just took forever to converge towards the top. Whereas I kept the best one. Usually it can keep evolving based on that best one better.
That's interesting. And second thing, with all of those factors that were already being discussed, so particularly with capital cost,
Yeah.
can you speak to any way in which either the method of deploying a drone or a robot from a truck was accounted for, or any additional training for the driver to be able to like manage these devices?
No.
Or do you see that as something that's kind of a future consideration?
Yeah, that's like because these are I think the parameters are relatively rough already, and I don't. It's probably I'm not comfortable with adding more like additional $100 for like training.
Sure.
Like this is just a rough example, but like I think it's just trying to capture the magnitude of differences of where they lie on this scale from 0 to like truck costs, where their relationships are between the capital costs of the alternative technology, not necessarily going into the details of what they would each require and what additional cost that would entail. We good? Awesome. Yay, okay.